So we're talking about whether morality is real or whether it is some kind of fiction or something in between. So let's define moral realism first. Uh, I think generally people assume that morality is real. So people think, that it's not when you say that murder is wrong, you're not just kind of making stuff up. You're actually telling a truth. There's something real about the idea that some things are deeply wrong. So the question is can we prove that morality is real? Or there are going to be challenges from anti-realists to say, well, what makes you think it's real? Can you prove it? And that might be a difficult thing to do. But certainly a sort of general assumption is that morality is real. So let's just give a little bit more kind of detail to the whole idea of moral realism. So moral realism says that there are objective moral facts, right? So it's not just subjective, it's not just a matter of opinion. It is totally objective. That's what moral realism claims. So it says that the moral properties like goodness and badness or right and wrong exist independent of our opinions. So people may think one thing, but like scientific facts, morality is real independently of what people think. That's the basic idea. So one way of putting that is to say that moral statements can be true or false, just like statements about the physical world. It's like the facts about the world. So then they're not made up by subjective views. They're not made by emotions. They're like real things about the world. And then if there are moral facts, and then if we know those things, then moral knowledge is really possible. So often we think that scientific knowledge is our best example of real knowledge. But the idea of moral realism says, well, moral knowledge is real too. There are real things we come to know through our understanding of the world. Makes sense, right? All right. Right, so that's moral realism. Now let's think about moral relativism and subjectivism, which are also relatively common views these days. So for example, there's cultural relativism, which says that moral claims are not universally true. Rather, they say that cultural relativism says that moral claims depend on what culture you're in. So whether something is right or wrong depends on your society or your culture. And it changes from one society to another. Now, exactly what it depends on in society, different moral theories have different views. So one view is that it depends on what the majority of a society believe, or it might be that it's not the majority, it's not democratic, it's rather what the leaders believe. So you say like the leaders of society tell us what the moral truth is. So both of those are kind of relativistic views. They say that morality depends on your society, that it's not totally objective. Morality still exists, but it's like it's more like truths of kind of stuff which is created by your society. I mean, one sort of parallel would be like money, right? Money is something that societies create. Money isn't something sort of objectively real. Rather, money is something which is created by society. So the idea of morality would be sort of like money. Like the society creates morality in the same way that it creates money. And the fact that everybody believes in it means that it's kind of real for that society. So here's a slightly more detailed version of moral relativism. So clearly it denies universal morality. It doesn't think that moral facts are like scientific facts. It says that moral values are products of cultures, in the same way like money is a product of a culture. And so it seems like morality can change from one society to another, and also morality may change as a culture changes. So moral judgments are not universal across cultures, or they're not universal across time. Rather, they are dependent on a particular context. Now, I mentioned cultural relativism which is basically the main form of relativism, but it's also worth mentioning subjectivism. Subjectivism says morality doesn't depend on the particular culture, rather morality depends on you, that you create your own morality, and it depends what is true depends on how you create your own morality. I guess like that sort of subjectivism is like seems an even more extreme view. I mean, we can sort of make sense of the idea that morality is like money and everybody has to believe in it for it to exist. For me to create my own personal morality seems like it's just like totally individual, totally subjective. And so each different person then would have their own personal morality, not just their own personal beliefs, but their own personal morality, and I think things would be true according to their own personal morality. But that's an even more extreme form of relativism. It's worth distinguishing, but basically what I'm talking about is like what we call a normative moral relativism, which says that there really is morality in different cultures, and that morality really does kind of change from one culture to another. Now, there is a sort of more kind of anthropological view, which is not about what's really right or wrong. Rather, it's about the idea that different cultures have different moral beliefs. And that may well be, and it seems like that's an empirical claim, the descriptive claim. So you might say that medieval Christianity had different beliefs from medieval Islam. So you had Islamic culture and you had Christian culture, and they had different moralities. That's not making a normative claim about what's right and wrong. It's simply making a descriptive claim about different cultures. So it can be used. Sometimes those two things get confused. So the normative moral relativism is making a bigger claim that simply that different cultures have different beliefs. The normative view is saying actually that morality itself changes from one culture to another. And also that no culture is right or no culture is wrong, that each culture just has its own morality. Just to say a little bit more about that subjective view, that's the idea, I think it's worth spelling it out I've basically already said this, but it's a very extreme view of moral relativism. It says that morality changes from one person to another, and like what's true for one person is going to be not true for another. So like suppose in an extreme version of this, suppose I say my morality is that it's okay for me to kill other people. Then it would genuinely be okay for me to kill other people by my morality. I mean, that sort of very individualistic view, I mean, it seems like, if you get to that very individualistic view, then it seems like it's not very different from denying that morality exists altogether, because in some ways, part of our idea of morality is like it should be governing a whole bunch of people, not just like each person make up their own morality. All right. Now, one of the big issues when we're thinking about moral truth, and one of the big reasons that people have been attracted by relativism is that they think that it's good to be tolerant of other people's beliefs. So, like about 100 years ago or so ago, there were anthropologists who started studying other societies. And they noticed that other societies do have different moral customs. I mean that wasn't like a big discovery, and people knew that in ancient times too. But they started taking the scientific study of other societies seriously, and anthropologists uh, started arguing that for a form of cultural relativism, and they say we should not judge other people. We should not judge other societies. And they said that Western society has its morality and non-Western societies have their morality, and we can't say who's right or wrong. So really what they were trying to do is say we should be totally tolerant and we should not be judgmental. So there's a big question of like, well, were they confused about that? Because if you actually believe that it's good to be tolerant, it seems like what you're saying is that tolerance is something which is really good and everybody should be tolerant. Whereas if you're a total relativist, you'd say, well, what about non-tolerant societies? Well, that would say well, non-tolerant societies are, they have their morality and that's fine. Seems like really what the moral relativists back 100 years ago really wanted to say was that tolerance is a really important moral virtue, and we should learn to be tolerant of different moral views. But it seems like really what they wanted to be was moral realists about tolerance. So what I'm suggesting is like that kind of motivation for moral relativism was actually pretty confused. And if you really think that tolerance is important, I think these days we do think that tolerance is important, then what you should say is tolerance is something we should everybody should value. All right. Now, moral relativism has obvious counterintuitive problems. So if you look at human history, and I guess especially like in the 20th century, there were terrible moral atrocities. The Nazis had concentration camps where they tried to eliminate the Jews. In Cambodia, there was in the second half of the 20th century, there was a massive movement to kill a minority of the population, which led to the killing of about 2 million people. If you think about the history of the United States in the 19th century, there was slavery. So if you're a moral relativist, it seems like you would have to say, well, if they believed in it, then it was right. If the majority of the society believe in something, and it seems like, say, if you're thinking about the American South, it seems like the majority of the society did believe in slavery. So if you're a relativist, you're going to say, well, then it was right. Slavery was right. If the majority of Germany believed that it was right to exterminate the Jews, then the fact they believed in it made it the right thing to do. But when we think about those cases, we think, no, that's not right. There are some things which are absolutely wrong, irrespective of whether people believe it's right or not. And the kind of things we want to say are absolutely wrong are slavery and genocide. Right? You shouldn't be doing those things And if the majority of a society believe that it's right, what we want to say about it is like they were all wrong. So just because everybody in society or the majority of society believes something doesn't make it true. Uh, so it seems like that's a huge problem with moral relativism. Moral relativism says if the majority of a society believes something, then they're right. But you think, well, no, we want to kind of talk about something that we might want to say there are universal human rights which exist independent of what people believe in. So it seems like the case of moral atrocities like slavery and genocide lead us to say moral relativism has to be false. It also seems like if you believe in moral relativism, it means that we are not able to judge other cultures. But it seems like, well, you want to look around and say, well, look, some cultures are actually better than others. That doesn't mean that Western culture is right and other cultures are wrong. In fact, if you look at Western culture, you might say there was a lot wrong with Western culture, and maybe there even still is a lot wrong with Western culture. But we can't just say, well, morality is just relative, and there's no way to judge who's right and who's wrong. The third problem with moral relativism is like we want to say that within a culture, cultures make moral progress. So if you look at Western culture, we have, well, we'll be talking about slavery a little bit later on in the semester, but at least arguably, we have stopped slavery. There are sort of debates about that. There do seem to be a lot of people around the world who are actually still compelled to work and don't have much choice in it. But certainly the old-fashioned slavery, the chattel slavery, has been almost completely eliminated. And we think, well, that's moral progress. Another example of moral progress that we often like to praise ourselves about is women's rights. You want to say that back in the day, women were completely neglected, and they were thought that to be inferior. And we've seen some moral views which have said that women are inferior. But we want to say now, starting at the end of the 19th century and through the 20th century, and now in the 21st century, we think that women and men are morally equal, and that's an example of moral progress. But if you believe in relativism, you'd have to say, well, if the majority of people in those societies said that women are inferior to men, then that was true. So it seems like we want to say, no, that we've actually made moral progress, and those people back then were wrong about that. So it seems like those are big problems for moral relativism. And so moral relativism is looking like a pretty unattractive view. There's another issue about cultural relativism, especially. So the idea of cultural relativism says like if the majority of a culture believes something, then that's what's true in that culture. But these days it's pretty tricky to think about what do we mean by a culture. And that's especially a problem in a place like the United States, where if I say, well, what does your culture believe? It's like, what do you mean? What's my culture? I mean, like, is it my religion? Well, I mean, do I necessarily believe what my religion says? No. Is my culture defined by my race? Not really. Is it defined by my culture? Or by my sex? No. Seems like, what is my culture? Like, well, I don't know. No. It's like asking, well, who are my people? Well, I don't know who my people are. It's like I live on Long Island. I don't necessarily think that my people are the Long Island people. So it seems like the whole idea of what your culture is just doesn't make a whole lot of sense these days. And in some ways, it's always been pretty complicated. You know, uh, there's always been mass migration in society. There's always been kind of influence of one culture on another, and people have always sort of picked and choose which parts of their religion they believed in. So the whole idea of saying, well, morality is what your culture says, has always been pretty complicated. It makes most sense if you're talking about like a small group of people who all believe the same thing. Maybe in some small like tribe somewhere or some small village somewhere where everybody believes the same thing. But even then, like, does that really exist, or did it really ever exist? It seems like whenever you have a bunch of people around, people disagree. So the idea that one culture always believes the same thing seems pretty complicated. And these days, with globalization, everybody has like cell phones. Even in such sort of remote villages, people are on Facebook and Reddit or Instagram or TikTok. So it's like there's huge amounts of cultural variation and cultural influence from one culture to another. So the whole idea of like defining a culture doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Um, so to kind of press this idea of the problems of cultural relativism, I've talked about like slavery, and I've talked about like examples from the 20th century. One case which is a big issue these days is female genital mutilation, which is the practice of doing surgery on girls to reduce their sexual pleasure and sexual freedom. Female genital mutilation involves the partial or total removal of the external female genitalia, especially the clitoris. And sometimes it also involves the sewing up of the vulva. So that's pretty extreme. There are different variations of it, but so you can identify 4 different types, but kind of it's all kind of sort of similar theme. Now, why is that practiced by different groups? There are different sorts of reasons. One reason is to ensure premarital virginity. Another reason is to make sure that women are less likely to cheat on their husbands. It's also seen as a rite of passage into womanhood, and sometimes it is related to beliefs about aesthetics, beauty, or cleanliness. It's a procedure with a lot of health consequences, which are none of which are good. It can involve extreme pain. It can involve excessive bleeding, infection. It can cause complications for childbirth, and not surprisingly, it can involve psychological trauma. So it's a very serious sort of thing. These days, the estimates are that 230 million girls and women alive today have undergone female genital mutilation in 30 countries in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So that's a lot of people. And it tends to be, as I said, it tends to happen especially in Africa. There's 144 million cases in Africa, about 80 million cases in Asia, about 6 million cases in the Middle East. It tends to happen more in rural communities and in smaller communities. And it tends to be done on girls either infants up to the age of about 13. So there's a lot of variation. And sometimes rarely, but sometimes it occurs in Europe, North America, and Australia, especially in immigrant communities. All right. So it seems like if you're thinking about cultural relativism, uh, one sometimes cultural relativism says, well, female genital mutilation is a cultural practice and should be respected, and we should not judge people or communities who do it. So that would certainly, if you believe in cultural relativism, that would be one of the consequences for what you would have to say about female genital mutilation in small communities where it's practiced. Now, certainly not everybody everybody in the community supports it, and often there are movements against it. So it's not like everybody in the community necessarily agrees with it. And certainly human rights organizations say that it's just fundamentally wrong, that to practice this on girls is a fundamental breach of human rights. And the fact that people in society believe in it, it does not make it right. And if you're trying to think about understanding it, it's like, well, which culture is it that you should be judging it by? Is it the village? Is it the national culture, global culture? So it seems like you have to, if you're going to try and defend it in terms of culture, you have to kind of be trying to say what the culture is, and that's pretty complicated. Okay. All right, so so that's cultural relativism and some of the problems with cultural relativism. As you'll see, it seems like cultural relativism is a pretty hard view to defend. Now, another view which we might look at is anti-realism, which says that morality just does not exist at all. Morality is just a complete fiction. So that would say that claims about moral truth, are just false or nonsense. So obviously, anti-realism is a very skeptical view. It's definitely saying that moral realism is wrong, but it's also saying that cultural relativism is wrong, saying like moral truths are never right. And so moral anti-realists say, well, people just make morality up because of their emotions or because that it's useful in a society. So they say it may be a useful fiction, but it's just not true. You might think that moral anti-realism is an unpopular view. And I guess, I mean, it's not something that people generally argue for. I mean, there are cultural relativists around. There's certainly moral realists. I don't think I've ever met somebody who sincerely argues for anti-realism, but there are some philosophers who have argued for it. John Mackey, who was a 20th century philosopher, argued for it, and Richard Joyce, a contemporary philosopher, argues for moral anti-realism. So what they tend to, if you're a moral anti-realist, you tend to kind of say, well, you can explain why people have believed in morality without thinking that morality is true. It's similar to people who say why people believe in religion or God. They say, well, religion isn't true, even though the majority of people believe in religion. And they say, well, the reason that people believe in that stuff is like it has served a purpose in society. So one reason you might say societies invent morality is like, well, life goes better in a society if people believe in morality. There are also sort of psychological claims. One famous thinker who gave a a sort of psychological account of why people believe in morality and religion was Sigmund Freud. There's a picture of the younger Sigmund Freud there. And so there are all sorts of people who've made sort of psychological explanations of why people believe in morality. Now, one question you might ask is like, well, if you don't believe in morality, then does that mean you endorse like killing people and cheating and stealing? Do they think that it's okay to go and just do whatever you like? Uh, Generally, like people like John Mackey or Richard Joyce or Sigmund Freud, they think no, it's still useful for us to be nice to other people. They don't believe that it's good to go around killing people. But they don't think morality is real. They just think like, well, life goes better so long as we're nice to each other. Right? So anti-realists still kind of support like laws and social rules to keep society functioning. They just don't think that morality is actually a real thing. One person we might look at in thinking about this stuff is somebody we looked at previously, the ancient philosopher Epicurus. Epicurus didn't really believe in morality much, if at all. He argued that what we should do is lead a life of happiness. And so Epicurus suggested, it's really important to have friends, and it's important to kind of love people. It's important to kind of develop your talents. It's important not to have lots of superstitious belief. And so he argued, like, so long as you live like that, then your own life will go well. So it seems like all these anti-realists are not arguing for in favor of murder or cheating. They're arguing that it's good to have social rules, but that's different from having morality or believing in morality. There are various anti-realists who give an account of morality, like what morality is basically going on in morality. So there's people like A.J. Ayer and C.L. Stevenson. They say morality is just the expression of emotion. So when you say that murder is wrong, you're saying, I feel disgusted by murderers. It's not stating as a real thing about the world. You're just talking about your own emotions. And a slightly different view, but pretty closely connected, is expressivism, which says that moral statements just express moral states or plans. And they think that we should we should discourage murder and theft and exploitation because society goes better that way. And we want to have society which is a smooth running society. So when you say murder is wrong, that expresses those sorts of ideas. Then there's Mackey, who you saw a picture of Mackey previously. He says that moral statements are trying to be true, but they're just wrong. And so he argued that really moral statements are always just false. His view is called an error theory. Doesn't really, in some ways, if you're a moral anti-realist, there's different ways of trying to explain away what morality is, and that those are the approaches they had. Right, so what would a anti-realist say about practical stuff? They say, well, if you think about stuff like factory farming, abortion, and punishment, well, obviously they're not going to say those things are either right or wrong because they don't believe anything is right or wrong. But they might also say that it's good to have empathy for others, and it's upsetting to murder people, and so it's not a good idea to murder people. So they might still have like a very pragmatic attitude about those things. And they might say, well, we should encourage stuff which makes society go better. But as anti-realists, they don't think there's any kind of real moral truth about anything. All right. So one view that came up in the kind of end of the 19th century and the 20th century is one that is often pretty popular, and it kind of maybe relates to a kind of moral subjectivism, but it sort of has got a lot of attention in the 20th century, and that is existentialism. So it's worth saying a little bit about that. So existentialism kind of grew up out of a doubt about the big institutions. So in the 19th century, people started doubting that the church really had any great moral authority. People started doubting that God existed. And so there was the question about, well, what should we believe in? And it was especially an idea in literature. There were the Russian novelists like Fyodor Dostoevsky, and then in the 20th century, there was like the playwright Samuel Beckett, and philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus. They all kind of engaged in literature. And they all kind of were addressing a sort of sense of crisis. It's like, well, what should we believe in? And their answer was that we should create our own moral truths. And in some ways, the way they put that was the idea that we should create ourselves. The idea is that modern life does not give us our own identity. Your culture doesn't give you your identity. The modern world is one where you have to create your own identity and create your own values. So you have one of the big themes in existentialism is that there is no pre-existing system of values that we can all believe in. And so each person has to kind of struggle to create their own meaning in life. So there's this real kind of sense that life is just really confusing and even upsetting because, like, who knows what you should believe in? Like, there's all sorts of opinions, but nobody seems to have the right answer. And the existentialist says you solve this by creating yourself and creating your own values, and that's a kind of a way to avoid meaninglessness and hopelessness. So in some ways, it's a very sort of psychological view of life. Now, to put this in slightly technical terms, let's give you some kind of language that they used. People like Jean-Paul Sartre had a slogan which said that existence precedes essence. So you exist in the world before you have an essence. You're born in the world without any predetermined purpose or nature. So clearly, like people like Sartre were going against the religious views. Earlier on, we talked about Aristotle and Aquinas. They thought that everybody has their own pre-existing role in the world, and morality is about going about living that role. Sartre says there's no pre-existing role. Everybody has to create their own meaning in life. There is no pre-existing meaning. You have to create your own meaning. Sartre especially paid a lot of attention to the idea of freedom and the idea that you have to decide your own values. One thing he said is you are condemned to be free. You can't just take on values from some religion or some authority. You can't have somebody else tell you what to believe. You have to decide what to believe yourself. So the existentialists were very big on the idea of absurdity and life just being really anxious, that in having to create your own values, it created all sorts of responsibility for you, and life is just totally up in the air, and you just have to kind of go for it and create your own values. And so this, if you look at the literature of existentialism, all their main characters are like really feeling really anxious, and like they're thinking, how should I live? Like there's a terrible responsibility about what's a good life, and they're very upset about it, and they're kind of like they're really struggling with it. And then sometimes they overcome this, they find their own meaning. In other existentialist literature, they don't find the right answer, and they just continue to lead a life which seems totally absurd. So existentialists talk about ideas like authenticity, so that once you create your own values, you have to be true to yourself. So the existentialist view is a very demanding one. You create your own values, and then you have to live your life authentically. And so often existentialists are very sort of dismissive of people who follow religion or just follow leaders. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche looked at regular people and said, they're just like sheep. If you've ever seen sheep, they just follow. They can be rounded up by sheepdogs, and they are totally passive. And Nietzsche is very dismissive of those people. He thinks they're sort of pathetic. He says, like, the truly great person has to be able to create their own values, and most people are not great. Most people are just sad. So a true existentialist life is making your own choices, defining yourself. That does mean that value is subjective, but it's not. No, we talked about subjectivism before. No, subjectivism seems to be the idea like, oh, today is Tuesday, so I'm just going to believe X. The existentialist says, no, you have to create your whole life. It's a whole life project. You have to really decide who you're going to be. And then you have to kind of commit to that. So it's like authenticity and commitment. Those are the kind of the true values of existentialism. So existentialism has definitely been pretty popular among people in the sort of 20th century, and there's still people around today who are big fans of existentialism. Here's an example, just to try and give a flavor of the existentialist view. So imagine somebody who really wants to help others, and they have to make a decision about how are they going to live their lives. So you can decide to devote yourself to helping others, and you can devote yourself to a life of compassion, of helping others, for caring for others. So on the existentialist view, that would be creating your own value. You're not just like following a pre-existing morality, you're creating the values in your own life, and you're committing to those values. So the existentialist idea is that you're not just taking on some religious duty from somebody else, rather you're creating the duty for yourself. You're creating your own values. All right. Now, I guess one thing we will want to say about existentialism is like, well, maybe that's true psychologically, I mean, maybe some people do create their own values, uh, but I mean, is it really a convincing view? When we were talking about kind of relativism, I mentioned there was like cultural relativism, and then there's like subjective relativism or subjectivism. It seems like that sort of subjectivity just seems like if morality just changes from one person to another, it doesn't seem like it's a very convincing moral view, although the existentialists kind of do manage to kind of make it more convincing by kind of painting it as a heroic thing. Um, I mean, it does seem the idea that many people have a sense of absurdity or a sense of moral crisis does capture an experience a lot of people have in life. Uh, Psychologists talk about the idea of identity crisis, and they kind of often like there's two main stages they talk about in terms of identity crisis. One is like adolescent identity crisis. Now you grow up, your parents tell you what to believe, and you kind of maybe you're brought up in a particular religion, and then you get to adolescence, and you start thinking that your parents are really stupid and they don't know anything, and you start looking at religion, and you think that's all nonsense, and then you have a sort of crisis. You think, well, what am I going to do with my life? Then there's a midlife identity crisis. You know, people who have kind of gone along with society. They've kind of married, they've had kids, and then they think, here I am, middle-aged. What does it all mean? And people go through a sort of midlife identity crisis, and they start to think, well, I need to completely reassess how I've lived my life. And they have often they do sort of they have big changes in their lives. But I mean, it is true that psychologically, some people go through these sense of crisis. So in some ways, it seems that existentialism has sort of a big psychological truth, at least for some people, but philosophically, it's not clear that it really kind of is a very convincing view. It is worth mentioning some attempts to kind of defend existentialist morality. One big name is Viktor Frankl, who wrote in 1946, obviously just at the end of the Second World War. He had a book called Man's Search for Meaning. Now, he himself lived in a concentration camp, and so he had a lot of experience of anxiety and sense of crisis. Like it's like, well, he lived in a society where the meaning had just crumbled. He had been persecuted by the Nazis. He was put in a concentration camp, and so he argues that one way to kind of deal with that kind of crisis is by creating a sense of meaning in life. Frankl had his own form of psychotherapy. He called that logotherapy. It was like it's a way for people to create meaning in their lives. And some people, his approach as a form of therapy really speaks to a lot of people. They say like, they go through crises in their lives, and then they read like Man's Search for Meaning, and they feel like, oh yeah, this is actually a very meaningful way to kind of create meaning in your life. So there is something interesting about it. I mean, these days, the Second World War seems like a long time ago, and maybe we don't really kind of feel the same sense of crisis. I'm not sure. I mean, young people these days have gone through not just the pandemic, but they've also gone through a life where kind of everything happens on screens, and reality seems like a lot kind of weirder. Whether people feel a sense of crisis or not, I'm not so sure. In the second half of the 20th century, there was a lot of emphasis on ideas of positive psychology. And one big representative of positive psychology was the psychologist Martin Seligman, who I think actually I believe is still alive. Uh, he was employed by University of Pennsylvania, and they have his website on positive psychology. Seligman promoted the scientific study of the strengths that enable individuals and communities to thrive. So he was especially focused on saying, like, yeah, life is difficult, and it makes a lot of sense to work on leading a fulfilling life and to achieve a fulfilling life. And he was very interested in how to get people to be happy. So he had a criticism of a lot of standard psychology, which was focusing on like people's unhappiness. And he says psychology would be much better off focusing on making people really flourish. So that's pretty interesting. And so it seems like what Seligman was doing was not really talking about morality as such, but rather he was giving a sort of psychological replacement for morality. He was giving a sort of personal psychology which would enable people to lead happy lives. And so the idea is that maybe that's what the future is. We're not really going to believe in morality. We're going to believe instead in developing psychology which will make people happy. And yeah, well, what makes people happy? Well, it seems like stuff like having coming from a stable background, having values makes people happy. There's a lot of evidence, for example, that if you are just focused on yourself, you'll probably be fairly unhappy. Whereas if you devote yourself to a community, if you try to help others, you're actually going to do better in life. So it seems like the way to lead a happy life is actually not to be selfish, but rather to work on leading, playing a major role in your own community or your own town or your own group. Now, obviously, these days, there's a question about how are we going to lead happy lives? And we might think about things like using artificial intelligence. These days, an awful lot of people are on antidepressants. And so maybe that could lead us to lead a happy life. There's a lot of talk these days about possible artificial intelligence, nanotechnology. Maybe in the future, we will all be implanted with nanotechnology, which will improve our brains and make us happier people. Maybe we'll learn to actually affect our genetics. So people who are genetically disposed to be unhappy, they could have genetics changed. So, and there's big questions about what the future of society is. So, I mean, there's big questions about whether or not psychology is going to be the complete replacement for morality. All right. One last view I want to kind of talk about, which is a return to thinking about morality, but is somewhat different from from the theories we've looked at previously, is moral casuistry. So we've looked at if you believe in moral realism, the theories we've looked at are stuff like utilitarianism and deontology and virtue ethics. They've all tried to give like big answers to what is morality. A far more kind of modest view in some ways is moral casuistry. And what moral casuistry does is rejects those big theories. It says like those big theories are not actually they're not true. And so moral casuistry says no big theory is the right theory. Moral casuistry says Casuistry says, like, really the answer to morality is just to believe, like, we understand particular cases of morality. So, you don't need necessarily a big moral theory about making society better, but we do have strong intuitions that, like, killing particular people is just wrong, stealing from particular people is just wrong, and those are like the things we should go by. So if we believe in moral principles, they're generalizations from cases. So moral casuistry says particular cases are sort of our fundamental guides to morality. That's where our real moral knowledge is, and principles can be derived as sort of rules of thumb from those particular cases. So moral casuistry is a kind of a form of moral realism, but it's a much more moderate version of moral realism. So moral casuistry leads us to believe in stuff like case-based reasoning. So rather than appeal to big theories like utilitarianism or deontology or virtue ethics, it says we should think about particular moral cases. And when you're trying to understand a particular new case, you don't appeal to a theory. You say, how is this new case related to other cases we have a pretty good grip on? So what you're looking for when you're thinking about morality is similarity from one case to another, and see how one case is how one case can morally illuminate another case. So it's all going to focus on context, and it's going to focus on analogy, and it's going to be very much focused on practical consequences rather than a big theory. So let's look at an example. So imagine you have a patient with a terminal illness who's in terrible pain. Suppose they're morally competent, so they are able to understand their situation, and they keep on asking for their doctor to help them die. Is that morally right or morally wrong? So you can imagine what like utilitarianism would say, and rights-based theories and virtue-based theories. Certainly, if you're thinking about it in terms of principles, you would think about ideas about patient autonomy and doing no harm. Those are the kind of traditional ways of thinking about those cases in terms of the big theories. Whereas if you think about it in terms of cases, you might think about cases which we're pretty clear about. So here are a couple of paradigm cases. If you suppose you have a patient with a broken leg who requests pain medication, then obviously it's right for the doctor to help the patient with the broken leg. You set the leg, you make them better again. That's a very clear case of how a doctor should behave. On the other hand, it's clearly wrong for a doctor to kill a patient who's just totally healthy and is not requesting any medical intervention. So what would casuistry say about this kind of case? Well, it says, well, you need to think about the particular context. You need to think about the particular severity and the kind of difficulty of the patient is experiencing with pain. You need to think about the patient's request and their competency. You need to think about potential for alternative ways for the patient to deal with their pain. You think about maybe the doctor's obligations to their profession, and you think about the law. And what does the law say about physician-assisted suicide? And then you reason through the case. So you think about, is a doctor who helps a patient to die, is that similar to other life-sustaining treatment, or is it similar to withholding life-sustaining treatment? Is it similar to withholding administering high doses of pain medication that may hasten death? Is it analogous to a patient refusing treatment that would prolong their life? So you look at cases you understand and feel reasonably comfortable about, and you try to kind of see parallels between that and the case you're looking at. And then like you may have like not absolute principles, but like principles you apply in this particular context, such as respect for autonomy and non-maleficence and beneficence. So those are all things that are kind of relevant to the thinking about the case. And then, according to a case-based judgment, you just there isn't necessarily a predetermined right answer, but the whole point is that you should be the person would reach a judgment. So that's casuistry. So in some ways, while the big theories may seem like who knows about the big theories, the casuistry says like no, we feel pretty confident about the big cases and particular cases. One of the problems with the casuistry is not promising any determinate answers. It's saying, well, you think everything varies on the particular case. And real life cases are pretty complicated. So, it's hard to know. Maybe it's not clear what the right answer is, but casuistry may be at least an acceptable answer to thinking about morality if you don't believe the big theories.